Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Jessica Freedman. I am the chair and founder of MedEdit's Medical Admissions. And for those of you who have not joined us for one of our lives in the past, I welcome you. I do these lives every week on Thursdays. I was doing them at 8 p.m. Eastern Central EST, but I changed them to 9 p.m. Eastern time because I found that was actually a better time for people to be here. So I forgot to put my mic in here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, so anyway, so welcome. I'm happy to have you all here. And if you are watching the recording, we do have many people who watch the recording of our Q&As. Welcome, and I hope that if you posted questions to our Facebook group, that I'm able to answer them tonight. We do have a private Facebook group that everybody is welcome to join. So if you are not yet a member of our private Facebook group, I do encourage you to join that, because before these lives every Thursday, I ask people to post any questions that they may have in advance, and that way we always start the sessions by answering those questions. So I'm going to hop on over to our parents Facebook group. And again, I'm going to actually put in the chat a link for the Facebook group, because if you are not a member, I encourage you to become one. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to see what questions we have over there. I see we have some great questions, so that's terrific. Okay, so let me start. So Siva asks, can you give some insight regarding the MD pathway program? Will there be any disadvantages to this route for medical school related to residencies? We are looking for the NeoMed pathway program in Ohio. So Siva, I would have to look up the specific criteria for the NeoMed pathway program and exactly what that program is. I know a lot of them, but I don't know them off the top of my head. If this is a program that guarantees your admission to NeoMed. There are some BSMD programs right now that aren't really BSMD programs. They guarantee you an interview, but they don't actually guarantee you a spot in the medical school class. So assuming that the BSMD program guarantees you a spot in the class, it's essentially the equivalent of going to medical school at NeoMed. And if you want to get a sense of how that's going to position your student once they're actually applying for residency as a NeoMed graduate, you want to take a look at the NeoMed residency match list to get a sense of where students are matching and what specialties they are matching into. And something that we routinely do when we're helping students to navigate what medical school to choose, we're routinely looking at those match lists to help them make that an informed decision with that regard. Okay, Selena asks, when would be an appropriate time to send letters of interest to universities? I've received no responses from some and have interviewed at a few, hoping to improve my chances of acceptance. If there are no significant updates to share, what should be included in these letters? So there are two types of letters that medical school applicants will routinely send to their medical schools during the application process itself. The first is a letter of interest, and that is a letter that you will send before you have gotten an interview. And those letters we find don't really often have much impact in the medical school admissions process. And we encourage students to only send those letters once they have significant updates to report to the medical schools. Otherwise, we find that they really have no influence whatsoever. But generally speaking, letters of interest we don't find move the needle all that often, but it does happen, especially if you have significant updates. If you don't have significant updates, I discourage sending a letter of interest at all. And I think that's primarily the question you are asking about. You can also send letters of intent, but those letters are only sent once you've actually interviewed at a medical school. And in those letters, you want to explicitly state that a school is your number one choice, and you will attend if accepted. And those types of letters, we do find those actually move the needle most definitely if you are waitlisted at a medical school, especially once we're moving further into the spring. They definitely have impact, no question. Okay. Ruchi asks, how many hours of volunteering in the medical field is generally recommended for BS-MD candidates coming out of high school? So for BS-MD applicants, we look at things a little bit differently because the application for BS-MD applicants is different than what it is for medical school applicants. Medical school applicants are filling out an application where they are indicating very exactly how many hours they have participated in an activity. But for BSMD applicants, they're filling out the Common App, and the Common App has a different way of asking for that information. You basically explain how many weeks out of the year, whether that's during the school year, during school breaks, and then you indicate how many hours per week you are participating in that activity. So I would say if it's a school year activity, we want to see 1 to 2 hours per week on average that a student is participating in that activity. And I would say if it's a summer activity, we want students, I apologize, that's our alarm. Somebody's going to turn that off in just a moment. If it is a summer activity, we ideally want students to be participating in about 4 to 5 hours per week. And that's sort of a general, ballpark figure. Those are general ballpark figures. And, of course, when we're making these recommendations, we're looking at students holistically in the same way that admissions committees do. We're looking at their other experiences and we're making recommendations based on that. Okay. Rubavati asks, I've heard some colleges don't consider the teacher's recommendation letters. Is this true? I have not heard of any schools that don't consider letters of recommendation. For every admissions process that I'm aware of that is even remotely competitive, letters of recommendation become one of the most important things in an applicant's profile that's going to determine their success in that process, whether that's college, whether that's medical school, whether that's residency. Letters of recommendation are vitally, vitally important. Absolutely. Okay. Ruchi asks, who should letters of recommendation writers be for BSMD programs? I would recommend at least one STEM letter, ideally a science letter. And then I'd recommend another letter from either history, English, or language, depending, on what the requirements are. However, for that program, you always want to look at a program's specific requirements. Aaliyah asks, what is more important in medical admissions, clinical volunteering or research? So I would say, Aaliyah, that at this point, if I had to choose one, I would say clinical volunteering or clinical exposure or clinical work is probably going to be the most important thing. All right. Now, again, this really depends on what type of medical school you're applying for. Is it a DO program, an osteopathic medical school? Is it an allopathic medical school? Is it a research focused school? But all schools want to see clinical exposure and clinical work, ideally hands-on clinical work, but not all schools necessarily want to see research. But the most competitive, the most selective schools that are very research-focused schools, they want to see both. So it really depends on what the goals are in terms of deciding which of those is going to be most important. But certainly all schools want clinical exposure, no question. Okay. Christine says, an orthopedic surgeon friend told son that a gap year before medical school will hurt him in the long run because he won't get into competitive residencies. He estimates he eliminates candidates from his program that took a gap year. Is this common? I have literally never heard of this. I'd be curious to know what program that is. And in fact, what we are seeing is we're seeing that many applicants in medical school, when they're applying for competitive residencies, some of them are actually taking gap years during medical school to do research for their residency program. So this doesn't completely make sense to me. And I also have to be honest that most people, when they're evaluating residency applicants, they're focusing primarily on the medical school experience, what the student has done during medical school. They're not really looking at what happened and what transpired and what they did necessarily before medical school. A really, really, meticulous residency admissions officer will look at the medical school record and what the student has done. And I would tell you that I was one of those. When I was reviewing residency applications, I definitely looked at what happened before medical school because I wanted to see if there were gaps in time. I wanted to see if there were any red flags, because medical school is 4 years. It's a track in some way that makes life a lot easier, to a degree. So I always wanted to look at that pre-medical school record and what was happening and how the students spent their time. But I can tell you, I know this again, just based on my colleagues and how they reviewed applications, that most people are not looking at what happened before medical school when they're making assessments for their residency applicants. Okay, Jua asks, my daughter is graduating this December, so she will have 1 semester free to prepare for the 2024 application. She did her MCAT already. Amazing. That's terrific. Already has 3,000 plus clinical hours from medical scribe job. That's fantastic. 500 plus hours of volunteering for community service. What kinds of jobs does she need to do in the coming months? She does not like research and believes medical scribing is the same as shadowing. First of all, medical scribing at this point is considered a better opportunity than shadowing because it's hands-on. So those 3,000 hours of hands-on clinical work as a medical scribe is going to really help to set her apart. Again, it depends on what type of medical school she's looking for. If she's interested in a top tier medical school, a research heavy medical school, they are definitely going to want to see research. I would like her, even if she doesn't love research, to get some research experience, just because I think not having it is potentially going to cut her out of some medical schools. It's going to make her less competitive for those medical schools. But I would say that if she really is just, she's okay going to a school that isn't research focused, those clinical hours are going to really help her a lot. And I would probably advise her during her gap year to get some type of community service work or some type of other clinical work that involves working with a patient population different than the one she's been working with thus far, and maybe to diversify her experiences a bit. But certainly having, 3,000 hours in anything, whether that's research, whether that's clinical work, that really is going to help her to excel in the process. And this is something that we are paying more attention to now than we have in past years, because we do find that students who tend to, have more significant hours and, really show a focus in terms of their interest, they are doing better, in terms of the medical school admissions process every year. So those are sort of some of the trends that we are observing right now. Okay, so if you have any questions, go ahead and post them wherever you are in the chat, and I will go ahead and I'm going to start to answer those now. So Dylan asks, when should I consider reapplying? I have 1 interview so far, but I don't know if I should start for next cycle. So Dylan, if we are in the beginning of December and you have 1 interview, that is outstanding. I can tell you that we work with students every year who get 1 interview and they get 1 acceptance. So you want to do everything in your power to turn that interview into an acceptance. So I'm assuming, obviously, if you have had 1 interview, you haven't heard from them regarding, their ultimate decision. We would want to know when you expect to hear from that school. Is it a school that extends admissions decisions on a rolling basis, or is it a school that will extend all of their acceptances at one time? So we would want you to try to make the most of that interview. That means potentially sending update letters. That means potentially sending a letter of intent. We don't want a student to start thinking about a reapplication until January of the application year. So we're talking about January of 2024. So at that time, we might want you to start thinking about, okay, what might I do to even get more interviews next year if it turns out that I have to reapply? But we would want you to really, work that interview to try to convert it into an acceptance. And I can tell you every year we work with students who, have 1 or 2 interviews, even much later in the cycle. And, and we just do everything in our power to try to convert that interview to an acceptance. If it ends up, let's say the initial decision is a waitlist decision, then we want you to do everything in your power to convert that waitlist into an acceptance. So I would say right now it's a little bit too early, especially depending on when you interviewed. It's a little bit too early to be thinking about a reapplication. We should wait until January. Okay. Gabriel says, I have 160 hours of optometry shadowing. Should I include it in my medical school application? It's a little tricky. I would want to know what other shadowing experiences you have. If you have other physician shadowing, I think it would be okay to include it if it sort of is just part of one of those experiences. I think optometry shadowing can be valuable, especially if you are, doing some of the real hands-on work that the optometrist is doing. But I wouldn't want the optometry work to sort of be your standalone experience that kind of represents all of your clinical exposure. So I think it probably would be okay to include, but we would want it to be included together with other experiences, clinically. So it isn't sort of the only thing that's on the application that shows exposure to patient care. Okay. So Tom asks, Canadian medical schools do not have requirements. Do U.S. medical schools require Canadian schools to take all required courses? Yes. So U.S. medical schools are going to require all applicants to take the courses that they require. Now, some medical schools don't have really firm requirements, so they may be a little bit more lenient. But what I would encourage you to do, first of all, if you're a Canadian, you want to find out what medical schools are going to be Canadian friendly. You can find that information on the MSAR. And then among those medical schools, once you find out that information, you then want to look at what their requirements are. Again, you can find this in the MSAR. That's the medical school admissions requirements. If you're new to this whole process, you definitely want to get a subscription. Maybe not when you first start the process, but once you start thinking about what medical schools you might want to attend, and then you can look up the medical school admissions requirements for each of the medical schools that considers Canadian applicants. And if there's a question, call the medical school directly and ask them about the requirements. But medical schools, the ones that have the requirements, and they're really firm about it, they're not going to be yielding on that. Okay. Okay, so someone says that most of the programs on the direct BSMD list that we offer are not guaranteed programs, and they're only offering interviews. Yes, we are noticing that a lot of programs this year especially have converted from guaranteed admissions just to guaranteed interviews. We're also seeing the closure of a lot of BSMD programs, and we're seeing that more what we call early assurance programs that students are allowed to apply to while they're in college to guarantee admission to medical school. More of those programs are popping up. So there definitely is sort of a shift in terms of what's going on with the medical schools and who they're taking for their, sort of their guaranteed early seats. And we're definitely seeing a shift from those guaranteed seats for high school students to having more guaranteed seats for undergraduates. And sometimes it's not so easy to find those programs. Some colleges, if they have medical schools affiliated with them, they're going to have some guaranteed seats for their own undergraduates through early assurance programs. And again, there are more of these popping up. So I will have our team go and look at that list that you posted and try to update the information there. Sometimes it's tough to really stay up to date on all of these changes because they're happening so fast, and they aren't always announced in the most they're not really broadcast. So sometimes it's tough for us to find out. We often find out from our students sometimes when there are changes like this. Okay, so are early assurance colleges better than regular pre-med colleges for high school? I'm not sure exactly what this means. If you could clarify that question, I'm happy to answer it. I don't know if you mean like doing early decision or if you mean a BSMD program. I'm not really sure what your question is. So if you can just rephrase, that would be awesome. Uh, okay. If not BSMD, which one is the best assurance interview or regular? Again, I think if you're asking about early assurance programs you apply to as a college student, I mean, one of the most well-known ones is FlexMed, which is the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, which is where I worked, and I was on the admissions committee there. I know that program quite well. But again, if you're asking a different question, if you could just post it again, and I'll answer again as I scroll down. Hi, Fernando. How are you? Thank you so much. Is it okay to go to the same college for undergraduate and medical school? Absolutely. And this happens a lot, and happens a lot, not because medical schools necessarily give preference to undergraduates at their, sister or brother institution, but because many students, let's say you go to Vanderbilt for undergrad and you do your research at Vanderbilt and you're scribing at a Vanderbilt affiliate. And, so your letters of recommendation are all from Vanderbilt faculty. So they kind of, it gives you an edge in that regard. And this is why at any institution that has an affiliated medical school, you're going to find a lot of undergraduates from that undergraduate institution. How competitive are MD PhD programs? They are really competitive. It is essentially like applying to 2 programs at once. And, our students who are competitive for MD PhD programs, they have really exceptional research. They have a lot of research, and they're very, very focused in terms of what their research interests are. So they're very competitive, more competitive than applying to medical school alone. Okay. But again, you really have to show dedication to wanting to be a scientist as well as a clinician. How important is volunteer work? I would say volunteer work, I consider it a requirement. As a physician, you're going to be doing a lot that you aren't paid for. You are serving humanity. You have to treat everybody regardless of your own personal biases or beliefs. And so that service to others is vital. It is absolutely a requirement. You have to have community service or volunteer work as a pre-med. Okay, minimum GPA and SAT for BSMD and other activities. So GPAs are a little tough because GPAs are inflated everywhere. And GPAs, especially for high school students, are always going to be looked at within the context of the high school. So when you're deciding, you want to be on the high end of whatever the average GPA is at your school. But so you want to look at the school profile, the high school profile, to get a sense of what grades most students are getting at your high school. And you want to be at the high end of that. I'd say a 3.8 or higher, depending on where you go to high school, depending on, is there a grade inflation? Does everyone get an A for everything? Okay. The SAT is more important, especially for BSMD programs. I do not consider it optional. I would say a 1520, 1530 or higher, with the higher score, if there is a higher score potentially in the math section. But students who are getting into BSMD programs, especially the most competitive ones, definitely have high SAT scores, no question. And I'd say a 35, 36 if you're taking the ACT. Okay. All right, Jennifer, let me see if I can dive into this question. Okay, transcript for application to medical school has 2 science courses with labs that are listed as taken remotely. This was summer 2021 when everything was still remote, and even fall of 2021. Some medical schools say that remote labs, that they say no to those. So things are totally different when it comes to COVID. So what I would do in this instance, Jennifer, is I would call the medical schools in question. I would verify for them that these were labs that were taken during COVID when in-person labs were not available. They were not offered by the school. They're most likely going to just say, don't worry about it. We know. I mean, we're also at this point accustomed to the limitations that COVID presented. They've dealt with this before. I really doubt they're going to ask your student to go back and take those in-person labs, especially if they have upper level science labs, depending on what their major is. I wouldn't worry about it so much, but do call the schools just to confirm. Okay. Good evening. So Jayatika asks, good evening, Dr. Freedman. Hello. Is it better to take a clinical coordinator job or a clinical research job during the gap year? These are both fantastic opportunities. I wouldn't say that either is better. I would say that it depends on what else the student has in their background, and that's how we would make that determination. I would also, if the student, for example, has no research at all, I would probably lean more towards the clinical research job. We would also want to know the roles and responsibilities of both of these positions, who they're working for. Are these completely new opportunities, and what else is on the scholarly and the extracurricular record? But these are both fantastic opportunities. If you have them both, that's amazing. Okay. So 3 interviews 2 months ago with no answer yet. Painful, and we were told most likely will be waitlisted. So 3 interviews is a lot of interviews for the medical school admissions process. And this is the number that most students who matriculate have. So if you are being told, if you have 3 interviews, and I'm curious why, who's telling you you're likely going to be waitlisted, because medical school admissions committees do not give that information to students. I'm wondering if that information went to the pre-med advisor where you're getting that information. So I would wait until you got those decisions. But I also think that if you had 3 interviews 2 months ago, I would expect, unless they're all schools that release decisions in March, I would expect that you would have at least one of those decisions now. So you might want to call the medical schools to just to inquire about the status of your candidacy and to ask when you might be hearing. But I'd probably wait until January, to kind of make any definitive choices here in terms of, will there be a reapplication? Do you need to start thinking about a reapplication? But I'm optimistic when students get 3 interviews. And if a student, let's say, has 3 interviews and they all convert to wait lists or denials, then what we're looking at is we're probably looking at something that's lacking with regards to the interview skills, something that's transpiring during the interview. And so we have to kind of dig a little deeper on that to figure out what we need to fix for the next cycle. But I'd probably wait until January to really kind of make any decisions based on this. Okay. So Carolyn asks, clinical experience question. My son is a pharmacy tech. In his state of employment, pharmacy techs are hands-on with giving COVID tests, directly working with customers, and he is also certified to administer vaccine. Is this credible clinical experience? Absolutely. And working as a pharmacy tech, especially depending on the state, is a great way to get clinical experience for a pre-med. I think it's a fantastic way to get that experience, because a lot of pharmacists are, they're practically primary care physicians for some populations and for some individuals, because patients when they're on multiple medications, oftentimes they don't have time to ask the doctor, or they forgot to ask the doctor a question that they, have about a medication or about a condition. So, I think that pharmacists play a really crucial role in the care, in patient care, even sometimes going beyond what they're supposed to be doing. So I think that's actually a great way to get clinical experience, and this most definitely counts. Now, I would still want the student to get some type of, it could be shadowing, doesn't have to necessarily be hands-on, but I would still want them to get some kind of exposure working with MDs and or DOs, depending on what they're applying for. But it doesn't have to be work experience. Pharmacy tech is a great way to get that experience. Okay. Good questions today. Angela asks, my daughter worked for 6 months as a nursing aide full-time during senior year. Even if it was not with a physician, will her experience be valued? Absolutely. So working as a nursing assistant, a nursing aide, is amazing experience because you are working directly with patients. You are observing teamwork. You are observing, healthcare setting operations, you're collaborating, and just by osmosis, you're learning about clinical medicine, and you're getting your hands dirty, and you're doing some things that are really not glamorous in medicine. I can tell you that when, I was working with my residents, and when I saw medical students who, let's say, took a bed, helped a patient with a bedpan, or, did something that just wasn't necessarily part of their job and wasn't really glamorous, they earned a tremendous amount of respect, because as a physician, you should be doing things that aren't always your job. You should just be lending a hand when a hand is needed. So I think working as a nurse's aide or nursing assistant is actually fantastic work. It'll give you a lot to talk about. So I think that's terrific. Okay. So Gabriel asks, I have 300 service volunteering hours, but not necessarily clinical. Would this fit in the volunteering requirement? So absolutely that fits it as volunteering. So not all of your community service should be, clinical. Not everything is clinical. So, definitely your clinical work is, what is most important when you're applying to medical school oftentimes. But, working with other types of populations, having interest in other things, all of that is very important in this process. So we don't expect that every student should spend every moment of their time in sort of the classical pre-medical experiences. And plus it just makes for a more interesting application, gives you more to talk about on interviews. So that's absolutely not only acceptable but recommended to have experiences that are outside the clinical realm. Okay. If you need to reapply, when do you hire a consultant to help with essays and list? So I would say, first of all, if you need to reapply, you don't want to be thinking about that until January. So you don't want to be starting on anything at this point. I would say if by January, you don't have any interviews or you don't have any acceptances, let's say you have one interview, two interviews, but no acceptances, at that point, you probably want to make a meeting with us. If you're interested in working with us, we will do a complete evaluation of your application. And then we're going to kind of come up with a game plan. By this time, if you don't yet have an acceptance, we're going to work on A, B, and C, right? And so that we get that ball rolling to help you reapply, assuming you're ready to reapply. Sometimes we might look at an application and say, you're not competitive. Maybe reapplying right away isn't a good idea. Maybe you need to do something else to make yourself more competitive. And we might make those recommendations, depending on what your goals are and what your results were for the season. But I would say that probably first step is to have like an initial evaluation meeting in January or February. Okay. Just looking through the questions. Do charter school kids have less scope compared to public school kids? I'm not sure what you mean by less scope. Every student, when they are applying for college, they are evaluated based on the context of their high school and the opportunities at their high school. So students aren't expected to go outside their high school to get those experiences. So for example, if a high school offers AP exams, they're expected to have APs on their transcript. But if they're not offered, if you don't have AP exams, AP courses at your high school, you're not expected to take them. So you're only evaluated within the context of your own high school and your own high school population. I hope that answers your question. Is it better to do research at a post-bac program or to take a job as a scribe during a gap year? Well, it depends. First of all, you're only doing a post-bac program if you have not taken the vast majority of your medical school prerequisites. Most post-bac programs, assuming that you have a full course load, are very intensive. Most students are not going to have a lot of time for a full-time position, either as a scribe or as a research assistant. And in terms of which is better, it's going to depend on what else you have already done. So if you already have, let's say, extensive research experience, we might recommend scribing. If you, let's say, have neither, we would probably still recommend scribing. If you have a ton of clinical work, but you don't have any research, we might recommend research. So there sort of are never a kind of definitive, this is the thing to do during a gap year. It's going to depend on what your overall profile looks like and where you can potentially build upon experiences or where you potentially can add on to experiences. Okay, so how do medical schools look at online courses taken while in active duty in the military? This is going to depend on the medical school, and I would probably confer with the medical school in question that you're interested in. Most medical schools are not going to accept online courses, especially science courses. They're not going to take those unless it was a situation like COVID when everything was online. Most medical schools are not going to accept online coursework. Some will, but for the sciences, I don't know of any schools that are going to accept that. So, I would probably check with the medical school because, again, if you have a very specific situation, which it sounds like you do because you are on active duty, that is a time when they might make an exception. And medical schools certainly make exceptions for students. So I would check with some of the medical schools that you're interested in applying to. So someone said, Dr. Freedman, your earlier comments about research hours, how are these documented? So in the medical school application, you are actually putting down the total number of hours that you have devoted to an activity and then your anticipated total hours that you anticipate devoting to an activity. For the college application, you're stating how many hours per week you have participated in that activity. So those are the two different ways. And then how many weeks per year you've been a part of that activity. So it's a little bit different depending on the application. Okay. My son needs 2 or 3 more classes after senior year. He decided pre-med late. Is it okay to take them as summer classes? Absolutely. Many students take some of their core requirements as summer classes. He can take them at a community college, so those are accepted as well. But again, you want to take them at, an undergraduate college. You want to take them in person. But certainly if he just has a couple more classes he needs to take after senior year, and all medical school prerequisites have to be taken before you matriculate. So sometimes students are fitting in prerequisites, even if they've obviously already taken the MCAT, they're fitting in a couple of those prerequisites before they matriculate. So that's sort of those are the criteria. Okay. Yes, some medical schools do not announce their acceptances until March. So if you are somebody, let's say, who has only interviewed at the most competitive medical schools where they're not extending their acceptances until March, you still want to, if you don't have any acceptances, you still want to kind of make that reevaluation in, let's say, January or February. Sometimes a student in that position, it's possible that they just didn't apply to enough safer schools. And that's why all of their schools are March release date schools. And then if those acceptances, all of your interviews, all those results are coming out in March, then you would make a definitive kind of decision about a reapplication potentially after those decisions are released. You wouldn't make that decision necessarily in January or February. So, okay. So you mentioned that when getting several interviews and not getting any positive responses means interview skills may be lacking. Could you please elaborate more on that? Thank you. So sometimes when students, if a student, for example, comes to us like, look, I had 5 interviews, I didn't get any acceptances, I need to reapply. We, even during just an initial session with them, when we're talking with them, just kind of going over their application from last year, we're assessing, how are they interacting? How do they, answer questions? Are they reasonable? How are their communication skills? How is their maturity? And just sort of how personable are they, right? We're making those assessments not even in a formal sort of or mock interview setting. So oftentimes if a student is getting multiple interviews, there's a reason, there's something that the interviewers are picking up on that makes them uncomfortable, right? Sometimes it might not even be something they can put their finger on, but there's something that is making them not take the student. Because if you're getting the interview, it means you're competitive enough to go to that medical school. So, this is why when, by the same token, let's say when we see a student who gets one interview, let's say in, September, a really early interview, and then they're getting an acceptance from that school by the end of October, then that, by the same token, makes us feel really comfortable about that student's interview skills. We know that they're going to do well in the interview process. We're not concerned with how they're being perceived. So when you have multiple interviews and none of them have converted to acceptances, they've all converted to waitlists or rejections, we're concerned with how you're being perceived, in the interview room, so to speak. Everything's virtual now, but we're concerned with how people are perceiving you. And so we try to kind of figure out, okay, what is that perception and what needs to be done to improve that perception and how you're presenting yourself. Okay. So January is a little early to think you have to reapply. Yes, January is a little early to think you have to reapply. It's a good time to start saying, what will I have to do if I do have to reapply? So it's a good time to sort of start thinking along those lines. And number one, to come up with a strategy if that strategy needs to be employed. And number two, as well, to just sort of get your head in the game that this is a possibility. And that sort of helps you to be forward thinking in that way. And I think that just psychologically, that's important as well. Okay. Does a certain type of clinical experience, is it preferred or all viewed equally, like scribing versus EMT versus CNA? All of these are going to be viewed equally. Absolutely. It's about what you get from the experience. It's about your observations. To some extent, it as well is about your area of interest. So for example, let's say that you are a student who is interested in emergency medicine and you've done emergency medicine or pre-hospital research or something of that nature. For you, working as an EMT might make more sense, right? Working in emergency care. That sort of is more aligned with your interests and what you have sort of already invested yourself in. And then let's say if you're someone who has done some type of ophthalmology research or, something along those lines, and you're going to be scribing for an ophthalmologist, so again, it sort of is taking an area of interest, a demonstrated area of interest, and it's offering more evidence for that area of interest. So absolutely, each of those experiences, EMT, scribe, CNA, are equivalent, are equal, but some of it's also going to depend on what your interests are and what you've already shown evidence for in terms of what your interests are. That's also going to play into our recommendations. Okay. What tier medical schools can I apply for with an MCAT of 526 and a 3.82? You can apply. I mean, it's the MCAT is really that dictates in our opinion and based on our students, that is really the number, the objective criteria that's going to dictate where you're applying to medical school. The 382, so many different factors are playing into that GPA. Where did you go to undergraduate college? What was your major? What was the rigor of your coursework? Did you, let's say, just have a bad freshman year and every year since then, sophomore, junior, senior year, you had straight 4.0, you had all A's. So we're looking at so many different things when we're making this determination of what tier of medical school you're applying for. We're also looking at your experiences. So you can have a 4.0 and, a 524 on the MCAT, but if you don't have, experiences that sort of are as stellar, then you're not going to be competitive for the most competitive medical schools. So it's, you have to look at metrics, but then you also have to look beyond metrics as well to make that determination. But certainly just based on these two metrics alone, certainly you're competitive for all medical schools in the country just based on that. High MCAT students don't get accepted to safety schools, do they? First of all, there's no such thing as a safety school in medicine. If you have a high MCAT, again, if you have a high MCAT and you also have a high GPA, but you don't have outstanding experiences, then you might only get into lower tier schools. Are you potentially going to be looked at seriously by an osteopathic medical school? Maybe not, but there really is no such thing as yield protection in medical school admissions. We see high stat students getting interviews at all tiers of schools. And this is also why it's really important to apply to a range of schools when you apply to medical school, because the process is not predictable. And because one set of metrics is not going to determine your success in this process. So, but yes, absolutely. High scoring students definitely get accepted to safer schools. We don't call anything a safety school. Okay, let me just see what else here. All right. Okay, if a student transfers during undergrad and needs to graduate in 4.5 or 5 years due to differences in core curriculum, how will that be viewed by admissions committees? It will be viewed as your requirements changed and not in a bad way at all. So that's fine. That would be totally fine. They would want to know why you transferred, and hopefully you have a reason for that. Nothing wrong with transferring. Okay. Would medical schools look unfavorably at someone who works a few months in each medical assistant, research volunteer, etc., rather than in one of these areas? This is during a gap year. No, not necessarily. They wouldn't look negatively at that. I think that most serious positions, other than, not to say volunteering is not serious, it is, but you might not have to, devote and commit as much time. But as a medical assistant or in research, I would think that they're going to want a pretty specific time commitment from you. So most of our students would be doing, let's say, working either as a medical assistant and maybe, being involved in a research project they were already involved with, and then let's say volunteering on the weekend. So they might be doing a mix of those three things during a gap year. But certainly, depending on how you can sort of structure that year, if you're able to, I would say a few months of each would be fine on a full-time basis. But again, we would want to see what else the student has done in terms of making those specific recommendations. Do students in Texas have a disadvantage in applying outside of Texas? No. Texas students certainly have an advantage in Texas, and you have great medical schools in Texas. But just like any out-of-state student, they are viewed as an out-of-state student at state schools where the majority of the students are from in-state. And you need to be careful when applying to those schools, because a lot of state schools, the majority of their matriculants are going to be from in-state. But Texas students aren't going to be viewed any differently than, let's say, a California resident applying, to schools outside of California. Okay. What do you consider stellar experience in terms of volunteering, shadowing, etc.? I would consider stellar experiences something that offers evidence for the student's interest and something where the student is making a significant impact in whatever they are doing. Shadowing, it's going to be very tough to do that. And this is why shadowing experiences have become less important in the process, still necessary, but less important, because you can't really excel when it comes to shadowing. But in terms of volunteering, you want to, try to do something where you're really going to be able to make an impact through that experience, and where the experience in somehow is aligned with your other interests, whether that's, trying to, understand healthcare inequities better, educational disparities. You want to make sure that the volunteering is somehow aligned with your other interests that are evidenced by what you've already done. Okay, so this has been a great session, and I thank you all for all of your fantastic questions. We had a great audience, and if you aren't able to watch this live and you've made it this far, I thank you for watching the recording, and I hope to see all of you again here next week. And in the meantime, I hope that everyone has a fantastic weekend. We have some interesting things that we have in store for the new year, so I'll let you know what those are when I'm when we're closer to the new year. So anyway, so I hope that you all have a great weekend. Thank you so much for all of your time and for being here tonight. And I hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.